Lamadang Gombon Jambeyon La Shazo Lui Kongelo de Dimnien Tender Nietra Namda Rapsarave Chinye Dungun Chichen Zishre Nije Tugra Lebunze Kondai Sibe Tunre Mare Mentum Dungra Jizeve Grozoi Gonda Puje Darze Yin Lai Juju Yon Song Rudra Chedro Nyamo Nyelon Je Chao Ron Zen Mare Mesre Dungra Nyugu Chinye Chenze Rajanam Dene Dajin Saju Darzan Yenden Ludo Jase Tuku Chundra Chudan Chuni Jende Dale Mesre Jambe Yon Lai Zedin Chije Chenra Vesreje Dalu Demo Membara Srane Kadan Denje Jonglo Topaye Loje Pope Noa Saldo Kange Tenjen de Wanjong, Gabban me ba, Che me ba, Cheban me ba, Tang me ba, Wan me Bandro me ba, Tade de me, Denje me, Zheban Ye Ye Shin Nam Je, Zogbe Sanje Na Nam Je, Tangba de La Sha Zai Lo, Jamyan Shana Dorje Jen Re Zi, Saye Nimbo Deva Nam Brasir, Namge Nimbo Shamba Gondo Zong, Ni Ye Se Jin Je Lang Ge Sha Cao Cerab Gondo Si Ye Tan Ye Le Tamke Same Shage Yong Zong Xin Shan Shub Yin Be Lam Ken Karma Ba Me She De Be Je Yue Tsu Ge Tu La So Ne Chab Su Drove Lo Dang Shan Shub Ji Sem Rinpo Je Lo Ni Sal Tamne Tambe Chu Senro Nang.
So please begin by taking refuge in the free jewels and to generate the precious Bodhi-mind. And with that as your basis, please listen attentively to the teachings that are to be given.
Naso ta khatsan me teaching nang la dendam chonchup sem ngö la lo chedar jong ren ba te shu sin ta nyam ja tu ta tring khar le den do sana je thop tu dendam chonchu sem la lo jong su the ten na yong.
So in the previous session, the absolute perspective of the Bodhi-mind was explained, so-called the actual Bodhi-mind, and that concerns the practice of so-called meditation and how the practicing Bodhisattva trains in the absolute perspective of the Bodhi-mind while resting in an even state, that is to say, while resting in a meditative state. The next verse, which will be explained today, also concerns the absolute perspective of the Bodhi-mind, however, in the context of post-meditation.
Tate je thop tu yang nganzo dendam je semche ji kwa de tang mathalo ji je de ha chang ke chen bu yin sa de.
So in post-meditation, it's exceedingly important that one secures the mindset of absolute bodhicitta while in post meditation. One must make sure that one doesn't lose sight of absolute bodhicitta, as it were, in post meditation. So the first point made here concerns counteracting various attachments to objects of desire, evidently. And as was said here, the explanations are or concern post-meditation, how to maintain the actual body-mind in post-meditation. And the first verse then talks about that in the context of counteracting one's attachments to objects of desire.
Nipate dongyulte shedong gi yulla ngupren zembe zembat gapa.
The second point that will be made concerns aversion or anger towards other people, dislike and hatred for certain things, and so on, and how that can be counteracted on the basis of knowing that the objects of one's aversion do not truly exist. So this mindset, that of aversion or anger, is counteracted by way of knowing that whatever one's dislike is directed towards doesn't truly exist. The third point in this segment of the text, which concerns post-meditation, Jinso Parshin Truk concerns advice as to how a practitioner engages in the deeds of actions categorized as the 6 paramitas, generosity, and so on. So what's the root of endless rebirths in worldly existences? Well, it's viewing objects one is in contact with as real, in addition to attaching, in addition to which there is the adding of importance to these objects in the contexts of one's feelings about them.
ngundu churuyong we kechi shimatella tella hember lote lemdo yu.
Khenpo dancing kogo.
Dancing te lemdo yu. Tini la tenne ndopa te lemdo.
So if we look at what was just described in brief, in the context of desire for something. To begin with, the individual comes in contact with an object. Once that has happened, in that we're looking at a regular worldly individual here, what happens next is that he more or less at once sees the object as real, the object in question. And these two in combination, namely being in contact with an object seen as real, will produce a sentiment about the object. And if we look at desire, what happens next is desire for the object in question. And the desire for the object in question results from the two previous, namely being in contact with the object and seeing it as real. That produces a sentiment about the object, in this case, desire for the object.
Penangaranzo lo de kandesin rogindo ronang tsuru kakkorne and kanan korn zignada. Wangbo ngai yul la kare ngashona yang. Tit dembai bai den ngambatella shembati chesana dambar shember lo de chesana tene ti dambar shember lo te kechi ni patala ndetpa singe de ti yong do
Döpa det gårdtrampa.
ta te
Da döcha ina.
ja ndo sai
Tene shida ina de mogo trengero.
ja ta ndetpa te ti yong che
Ja.
ndetpa tela tene tela lo de pa njat rog do cha sid.
So one needs here, in order to be able to counteract the worldly mindset, understand how the worldly mindset functions. So, as was said, there are objects of knowledge. There are, for example, the 5 sense objects, visual objects, sounds, and so on. And when an individual comes in contact with an object while viewing it as real, that, as was explained, produces or will produce a sentiment about the object in question. And if we look at desire for something, what happens is that there is the sentiment of liking the object, and that in turn produces yet another sentiment, that of wanting to possess the object in question. So desire for it is reinforced by way of wanting to possess it. So to begin with, there is like for the object, followed by wanting to possess the object. And this is what is meant by desire for something. So in terms of the worldly mindset, you have 4 segments here, consecutive segments. To begin with, there is contact with an object. While seeing it as real, producing, in the context of desire for something, a like for the object, which in turn escalates into wanting to possess the object. And that's what's meant with desire. The mind attaches itself to the object by way of wanting it. So in terms of understanding these processes, one needs to observe one's own mindset, how one reacts, how one thinks, and so on, in the context of, for example, wanting to possess something.
Penangaran soke number shepa so chugindi yulla yidongwa tang yidu myowe tsema natsopo shardegdowa ndezon rene ungdegdowa
Tsenma natsopa sung du kan det ikke.
yidu ungwe tsema yidu myowe tsema
Re tenne dønta kan det ikke gå rett.
Tendeje nongbi yores yinang nongyulla tenne mari pechin chena ngazo shimbachi lemdo yorwa
Da Jiyong Yinadra, Jimyong Yinadra, ni cha dempare trengyo.
Yeah,
Marik
dempare.
betogi.
Yeah,
Di
marik.
kogo ge.
Yes.
Alltså.
ta di kabla penan desa ke nam to ina yiwong ki jesun ro ai pare tin de sholokan de desa ke nyem por song do wa dongbote.
So, in terms of the worldly mindset and its various functions, you have the five sense perceptions, and then the intellect, which both non-conceptually is aware of the sense object and also conceptually evaluates the object. So, in terms of being in contact with various objects, some objects are seen as attractive, some as unattractive, because of the appearances of the objects, their various characteristics, and so on. Some are deemed to be attractive, some are deemed to be unattractive. So, in terms of attractive appearances, desire happens. However, in both cases, attractive and unattractive objects, ignorance plays the role of seeing both as truly existent. Whether the object is attractive or unattractive makes no difference. The worldly mindset sees both as real. However, with respect to appearance, there is either attraction or the opposite, namely dislike for the object. In consequence of how the intellect evaluates or judges the object the person is in contact with. Now, the next verse in the text, in terms of the 37 practices, we come to the 23rd. That verse, explains about how a bodhisattva deals with desire for what he sees as beautiful objects, how he counteracts desire for those objects which he sees as beautiful or attractive.
This is yi tu we yul tang chepanna yarji tuje jasun chijin tu zepar no dambar mitawa
And that verse reads as follows: when you happen on beautiful objects, the practice of a bodhisattva is to forego attachment by viewing them as lovely but unreal as summer rainbows.
Ngarangi semlen roam, ngarangi amchola nyimbo, ngarangi nala trishimbo, tatindi ngarangi jela ro, troachi, rejan, ta reja njambala gawa, tsubala gawa yungre, kanta ngaranto tembe reja yungkin chila, then the shot levidoa.
So, in terms of the five sense objects, in the context of attachment to them, individuals react differently. Everyone doesn't react the same way with respect to the same objects. Some things that are attractive to some are unattractive to others. So disregard that. In terms of your personal analysis, you should personalize the analysis you make in terms of how your mind functions in the context of desire. So there are beautiful visual objects, there are pleasant sounds, there are agreeable tastes, there are agreeable types of touch, and so on and so forth. So whatever you find agreeable, you will discover when you observe how your mindset works. Whatever is found agreeable, you will tend to have a desire for, attachment to.
Tati jedu chayul ti jesu tenen chayul ti ngarana tomdo lo lep ti la chik zunju ji zamda ma zam zamne.
So, whatever you find attractive and therefore want to possess, you will make efforts to a very great extent to possess that object or the objects you're attached to, that you have desire for. In fact, humans are capable of persevering to a very great extent in order to get what they want. And this is one of the main sources of problems in the world. This is quite, or should be, quite obvious.
Yang chayul gi jesu manrowa. Tate dambare samne dik jesu pa ma sonje. Ko damba yemin la samna chitang bi na. What savage legri.
Now, if one decides that one wants to counteract these processes of the worldly mindset, what does one do? Well, one can begin with applying this to desire or attachment for something by way of stopping oneself, as it were, from falling into the trap of making efforts to possess what one wants, and instead take a step back, seeing that now I've gotten to the point where I want to possess this thing or this person. Instead of going for one's object of desire, one takes a step back and starts to think about the essencelessness of the object that one wants to possess. The fact that the thing or the person is in fact not real.
대체들 단들라 도미상보 가르송아르스나 차유 될라 예순 로마 되어체 코로나 딱제 지나는데 열개 자수는 신지래서.
So Thomas Sangpo, the author here, says, in the context of objects of desire, one should, rather than going for them in terms of making efforts to possess them, simply view them in terms of what they in fact are, namely lovely, attractive objects or appearances, but unreal as a summer rainbow.
That depends 차바지 밥 차바도 파 동마도 니마지 샤르노 이나 된 가동마도 dembe 잡에 이동하지 샤르기도가.
In the summer time, very often, due to the combination of rain and sunshine, rainbows manifest in the sky. They appear in the sky.
다별라 가도 야고 싶진도 나한테 고근도 뜨는 자든 죽긴 손다. 가도 양자대 생각 말이라 깔래만 오지 체.
Now, if a person were to view the summer rainbow as real and wanting to possess it and make the efforts he deems needed to obtain that summer rainbow, he would have to go through a lot of trouble and be exhausted at the end, and only finding out that it's beyond him to get what he wants. This is applicable to any object of desire.
One
can take the example of heads of state who fall into the trap of delusions of grandeur and set as their objective to take over the world, as it were. And they spend their entire lives with trying to defeat one enemy after the other, and the whole thing is endless, and in the end they won't be able to take over the world, but they'll go through such difficulties, trials and tribulations in order to get to this point where they rule all countries of the world, with the result of, in the end, finding out that it didn't happen.
That democratic longba so inandra, dictator longba so inandra, chickang royere. Daba king to a young.
Now, whatever type of government one looks at, whether it's a country that's democratic or a dictatorship, the same thing applies. Heads of state, all of them, of course, do not have the objective of taking over the whole world. However, they set out on getting to a certain point in a certain context and so on and so forth. And very often, if not always, politicians aren't able to get all what they set out to achieve. There is always a part of it that is about compromise, because it isn't really possible. to do what they've set out to do.
La dembare samki jesu ma songa che yu khurangel takche chitang bayina yur kanga ta chokpa cham jire deyang kechik memme tapare kechik dinje jur de yor tengal thopna yang jeong ya chira kamber.
Now, whatever one's object of desire is, it's important to understand that as a practitioner, one needs to not fall into the trap of trying to possess these objects of desire, because it's meaningless, it's not possible. Because in the end, all objects of desire, whether it's position, power, material objects, people, whatever the objects of one's desire, the common denominator for all of them is that each of them is just made up of innumerable perspectives, and in terms of material objects, particles. What is at hand is just a sequence of instances, making clear that whatever the object, whether abstract or actual, it's nothing but a process of change. So even if one were to take possession of it, one cannot be satisfied by possessing whatever one was able to achieve, because that something changes every instance. Nothing remains the same. The common denominator is that of impermanence, which simply means one can't possess anything. You can't possess that which changes every instance.
Tesonza pena yurte thoma thong kabla yurngon du churiyonde denen zebo ta yakojindu chenaya ngon du churju yurrange gela takche tangda den damba yo mare.
So objects of desire that seem attractive, lovely, beautiful, whatever, can never be possessed, simply because their nature is that of impermanence. The objects themselves change constantly. Di song songa?
Yeah.
Se po ya po yinayang?
Yinayang ko ngol te 당보 깨지 주른 로킹 메탁바레 대 메탁바 디고 노도면도 떠던 척바sam래 오 그런 얘기 말해 대인데 될 댐바레 잖아 마팅 아서.
One needs to correct one's view of things. One needs to see what is in fact the case, namely that there is nothing but constant change at hand. And if one looks at change itself, there is no actual concrete nature to it. It's plain and simple change. And change can't be possessed. Why? Because it changes constantly. It doesn't remain the same. So it's not possible to actually possess anything, whether abstract or concrete.
Pena jamden dege tingen ya yun boy non songa.
Lasso?
Juma Khenpo chige jadu wala.
Lasse?
단들라 다당 농보체당 공간세부지 줄쇼나야. 네 민간 홍나야. 데 담바 말와.
Now, Buddha Shakyamuni, as is recorded in the Samadhi Raja Sutra, said, in order to make the point just explained clear, think of a magician who uses a spell and is therefore able to make people believe that they see tigers, lions, palaces, whatever he has conjured up by way of the spell he uses. Think of those magical appearances. You would know that the tigers, the lions, the palaces that you see are not real. These are just conjured up by the magician. Now, all things are like that. Nothing is real. There isn't a single thing that is more real than these magical illusions.
제자 된대게 너무 볼라 담바름 메타와 주비나 신차의 punktu 그래. 신차 punk한테 야세 성주 셈배.
So
냠내제
to
송아.
forgo attachment to objects of desire, in order to be able to do that, one needs to correct one's worldview, how one sees things. One needs to view things in terms of objects of desire as lovely, beautiful, agreeable, but unreal.
당마 페이지 돈주 야추 대화치 야추노 대화 인트제 베스코 비조요바 쇼 손 빠자운데 된베 피니스 응어스 얘기를 사오면 홍하지요바.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's called. Well, sometime during the 80s, I think it was, there was this invention of having an auditorium where the movie screen was surrounding the people seated in the auditorium, and when the movie was put on, the people seated in the auditorium would feel as they were in the midst of what played out on the screen, in that the screen surrounded people. It wasn't just a square thing in front of you as previously. I can't remember the name for this type of movie halls. However, you probably know what is meant. You might have been to movie halls like that.
다 대뒤 사실 자주 가르름 책 송수.
Sue?
가르름 책. But 딘데게 베스코브 땅킨 송스. 빠는 피니즈 추든서 랑골 보온데 노아 담바리엔도 민도 tö당. 데니 대뒤 노아 썸나 담바 마이 고아치 데그도스. 딜레
Dämpa min du?
담바 맵스. 간스 충에게 보고 말어. Oh, today channel lojongda te denjin ka tu resong te tudin red.
The late Kalo Rinpoche at the time gave the following advice to many. He said, go to a movie hall like that. I went to one myself, and I think what they showed, if I remember it right, was the Niagara Falls. And he gave the example of a large waterfall being shown on a screen like that, you feel when you sit in the auditorium or the movie hall as if the water is falling upon you. However, while you sit there, you know that this is an optical illusion, so you react by having a strange feeling of being in the midst of the waterfall, it falling upon you, while knowing that the waterfall isn't real, and therefore what you see happening isn't really happening, because what's happening is unreal. The late Kalu Rinpoche, advised people at the time to do this in order to get the idea of how you can get to see what you think is real as unreal, in order to give a method or an aid that might help some people to get to the point where they correct their worldview.
Chazang Misig Nang La Nyamni Singate Kalayina Mandarwaji Ransom the Randa Madarwaji into Katu Inaya Nyamni Nangda
Rangsem da Madrella?
Yes, simply Nada Kakan Marwa.
Oh, I see. That's all.
Did you do Nyamni Singate Kalayina Shechov?
You see, your mind is always with you. It's not as if you can leave it at home and go out for a walk, for example. It simply never happens. It can't happen. So, what's the good news here? The good news is, since your mind is always with you, you can always, you can use any situation as a situation where you train your mind to see things properly in terms of what is in fact the case. So you always have an opportunity to make use of your mind on the spot in any situation. Meaning making use of your mind in a constructive way.
Shopping mall ben zewu chicken on chin. The shop things in on only a tea years, the dembare and the load the pan roman to a chair. Tenzo Kanga Metakpatan Jumata Wimbatan, Tenzu Yamnente, Rankichi Nanda, Yan Sem Juachi Tenden Robius.
You could spend quite some time in shopping malls, and instead of viewing the merchandise on sale there as real, you can train yourself in seeing the essencelessness of the merchandise you see and you're in contact with there.
Beijing Shubina, Penna, Nushu Kiramche, that Maha Atikananja of a chamber in Segiorwa. Chusol pay on to program Yuna, you are a mena, then handbag a chick no, then Coca Cola chick no, then Jamsu Kapala, beach cartier, then Yamaninga, you dig the second door. Then a Koran country in the Tanyam, she's a pay up on those Tenzo.
The late Nyushu Ken Rinpoche, known as a Maha'ati master, would, when visiting various Buddhist centers in his spare time, purchase a hamburger and a Coke, and then some member would drive him to the seaside if the center he visited wasn't far from the seaside, and then he would simply spend the whole day on the beach there. And is reported to have said that he found the beachside an excellent place in terms of training the mind as to seeing what is in fact the case, namely the essencelessness of each and everything.
라소 다 되게 차유라 내진 깎아 생겨진 사례 단 이빠때 동율라 ngambare hembe hembat 깎아 생겨들이셔.
So the verse we just went through concerns objects of desire. The next verse concerns objects towards, or rather, objects of aversion and anger, objects of dislike, and how to counteract attachment there. Because even though the object in question is unattractive, there is attachment to it. The attachment which sees the object as real. So attachment isn't a word used in the context of desire alone. There is always an element of attachment. The workings of ignorance which make for presuming that there is a real reality in the object at hand, whether the object is one of desire or one that one has aversion for, makes no difference. Attachment is there, attachment to the real reality of the object at hand.
라소 대송도 다쇼록 니슈자 잡지반데 송아 이사레 동가르 나소 밀람 부시 따라 출낭 덴바르 성외 하당체 대신은 멘트 진당 체베체 추바르다고 야세라는 연송.
And the verse reads as follows. Taking illusory appearances as real is exhausting, like going through the death of one's own child in a dream. Our many sufferings are like that. Thus, to regard as fantasy the unlovely happening of life is the practice of a bodhisattva.
다들 시동 생계대에 간대진 용기도 되었당 율이도 명외 천마지통.
So how does anger or aversion or dislike happen? It results from seeing something that is judged to be unattractive.
되네 다 된대기 천마 들라 되네 셈 제동 셈종의 지금 용투 되네 셈게 낭라 동알 땅 이메데와서 동알 망보지 제주기도 송을.
So because of the appearance of the something one is in contact with, because that appearance is seen as unattractive or disgusting, there are many variations here, of course, there is a sense of suffering and aversion arises. Aversion which takes as its aim to reject the something or somebody.
Then dungal naso, the dungal naso papena.
And that in turn results in various difficult situations where one suffers in terms of trying to reject what is at hand.
Dungal naso chegi yorala, tende mayin bache, senmate, yitume onwe senma koranda takje nana.
Now, instead of trying to reject whatever happens, the practitioner should take a careful look at what he finds unattractive in terms of the nature of what is unattractive. Thus, on the basis of proper investigation and analysis, the practitioner can come to see that what he finds disgusting or unattractive is unreal, and therefore anger, aversion and the like are not called for, are not constructive.
The condition those na perna that Jimmy ngala puji gogindo tene Thoma ngala milamdo pu go tingi yananda homo go tingi yananda
tanda milamgi pe erego
milamgi pere do jemi jin tat ningong la puji gogi yote tapathin te chen la milam tam
laso
puji go tenanda pomoji go tenanda te Jason Tembet Nam Dojong. Then the Jänner Lam Tagaram Mine, then Nasa upon Bud Hison Samna. That will do me. Jagra was not.
So consider a woman who wants to have a child. And she gives a lot of thought to this during the day. This may result in her dreaming that she gives birth to a child. However, the dream turns into a nightmare because the child dies. And so she experiences a great deal of suffering while dreaming of this. Then
that indeed dungete penna chunang jire ma to melam to buje yang do ma da xiang do
having woken up, she will realize that this was just a nightmare, a dream. None of it was real. So the dream images are simply a fantasy that never happened. So from beginningless time, this is what we've all been doing. We've generated and seen as real fantasies of ours. Fantasies that actually never have happened, and because of which we have suffered endlessly throughout endless lifetimes.
Day into maintain begi yitumong me yurchikan cheyon tu di yul korang turben homaji yimba.
So it's important to train the mind in order to get the mind to see that all of it is but a fantasy. Nothing has a real reality.
Yeah. Penand de Yungdua. Milam sing the Trunung Yimbar, Kamteve Michigla, Rangi Milam to put his shidro, Milam Tana and called Dunget Jig. Milam Trunung Yimbar, Kamcharwa.
Den tar ditt sikte konsum den tar kanske.
Tanda den der Indua. Penna Noa Kare Yidu moment Noa Kare.
Da Milam Mayimba.
Milam Mayimba. Milam Tanda Yidu Tanda Noa Chikpa Chikjan Redeorwa.
So whatever happens during the day is like the fantasies of one's dreams. There is no difference in terms of nature, essence, and the like between what is experienced in the waking state and what's dreamt of.
Tiyindu Penna Ta Hedong Dongyul Kandeji Shona Yang Toman Hungdu Ne Rang Chunang Pashaji Yimbar Tagarang Sembeten Church Tumna. Then Hedong Guang the Rogmare.
So whenever objects of aversion happen, or one is in contact with objects of this type, one should focus on seeing the fact that none of it is real in order to counteract sentiments of anger, aversion, hatred, dislike, and so on. Hade pollen det kan ungen.
Taji.
Gå chik monge. Vad samla på den tanken vill.
Lasso tanda te jagi.
We will end here for today because Khenpo Rinpoche and myself also, we both have a pollen allergy problem, and it's getting a bit difficult right now. So we end a bit early today. Khenpo Rinpoche isn't able to see the letters in his text properly. His vision has become quite blurred.
Sunam Deya Tamje Zipani Tomne Nyebe Dranam Pamje Chega Naje Balap Trubaye Sigbe Sole Drowa